The rope burned against her wrists as the horse's hooves thundered across the Arizona desert, dragging Eliza Hartwell through sand and stone, her crime refusing to marry the man who owned her father's debts. But sometimes the strongest chains are broken by the most unexpected hands. Welcome to a story of defiant survival and the unbreakable spirit of a woman who refused to be owned. Stay with me until the end of this 5-part saga and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Eliza's story travels across the world. The sun had no mercy in the Arizona territory, and neither did Marcus Brennan. Faster, Marcus. The little wildcat's getting too comfortable back there. Colt Jenkins laughed, his voice carrying across the endless expanse of red rock and sagebrush. He spurred his mount alongside Brennan's stallion close enough to see the blood seeping through the torn fabric of Eliza Hartwell's dress. Eliza's world had become a blur of pain and dust. Every rock that scraped against her body, every thorn that tore at her skin, every jarring impact as she was dragged behind the horse, it all served as a reminder of the choice she'd made. The choice that had brought her here bound and bleeding in the desert 40 miles from the nearest town. She'd said no. 3 times she'd said no to Jeremiah Stockton, and this was her punishment. Please. The word tore from her throat, raw and desperate. Please just stop for a moment. Marcus Brennan pulled back on the reins and his stallion slowed to a walk. The sudden decrease in momentum sent Eliza tumbling across the desert floor, coming to rest against a cluster of barrel cacti. The spines bit into her already torn flesh, but she was beyond caring about new pain. Everything hurt now. What was that, Miss Hartwell? Marcus's voice dripped with mock concern as he twisted in his saddle to look down at her. At 28, he was Stockton's most trusted enforcer, a man whose smile never reached his cold gray eyes. Did you say something about stopping? Eliza struggled to push herself up on her elbows, spitting sand from her mouth. Her dark hair, once carefully pinned in the style befitting a schoolteacher, now hung in matted tangles around her face. Blood trickled from a cut above her left eyebrow, and her white cotton dress, the same one she'd worn to church just that morning, was now torn and stained with dirt and blood. "Water," she whispered. Just a sip of water." Colt Jenkins dismounted and sauntered over to her, his spurs jingling with each step. He was younger than Marcus, maybe 25, but his cruelty ran deeper. Where Marcus was cold and calculating, Colt took genuine pleasure in others' suffering. "Water." Colt crouched down beside her close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Now, why would we give water to someone who's been so uncooperative?" The third man, Tommy Graves, remained mounted but leaned forward in his saddle. At 19, he was the youngest of Stockton's men, and Eliza had taught him arithmetic just 3 years ago when he was still a boy. Now he watched her suffering with the detached interest of someone watching ants being burned with a magnifying glass. "Come on, Colt," Tommy said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe we should what?" Colt's head snapped toward the younger man. "Go soft because she used to be your teacher. This here's what happens when folks don't pay their debts, boy, and when their daughters think they're too good for their betters." Eliza forced herself to focus through the haze of pain and exhaustion. They were maybe 4 hours out from Copper Ridge, moving southwest toward Stockton's ranch. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. If they maintained this pace, they'd reach the ranch by nightfall. And then, she pushed the thought away. She couldn't think about what would happen then, not yet. "My father," she managed her voice barely above a whisper. "Where is he?" Marcus laughed a sound like broken glass. "Your daddy. Oh, he's safe and sound back in town, Miss Hartwell. Probably sleeping off another drunk at the Silver Dollar. Amazing how a man can gamble away everything he owns and then just disappear when it comes time to pay up." The words hit Eliza like physical blows. She'd known about her father's gambling, of course, had watched him stumble home night after night reeking of whiskey and disappointment, had seen the worry lines deepen around her mother's eyes before consumption took her 2 years ago. But she'd never imagined it would come to this. "He owes Mr. Stockton $800. Marcus continued, clearly enjoying her anguish. "Plus interest. That's more money than your daddy's ever seen in his life, more than he'll ever see the way he drinks." "But that's not my debt," Eliza said, struggling to keep her voice steady. I can't be held responsible for... Can't you... Colt's hand shot out and grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His fingers dug into her jaw, hard enough to leave bruises. See? That's where you're wrong, schoolmarm. Your daddy put up his property as collateral. That little house you two live in belongs to Mr. Stockton now, and everything in it. He released her chin with a shove that sent her sprawling back onto the desert floor. Including you. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Eliza had known this moment would come, had been dreading it for weeks, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that twisted her stomach into knots. That's not legal, she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how naive they sounded. People can't be owned, not anymore. Legal? Marcus stood up, dusting off his pants. Miss Hartwell, we're 40 miles from the nearest town and territory where Mr. Stockton's word is the only law that matters. Legal is whatever he says it is. Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Marcus, maybe we should... Should what, boy? Marcus's voice carried a warning. You having second thoughts about following Mr. Stockton's orders? The young man's face went pale. Everyone in Copper Ridge knew what happened to people who crossed Jeremiah Stockton. The previous sheriff had tried to investigate some of Stockton's business dealings. They'd found his body 3 days later, apparently thrown from his horse. The fact that he'd been shot twice in the back was officially overlooked. No, sir, Tommy said quickly. No second thoughts. Good. Marcus walked over to his horse and untied a canteen from his saddle. For a moment, Eliza felt a surge of hope. Maybe he would show her some small mercy. Instead, he unscrewed the cap and poured the water onto the ground, watching as it disappeared into the thirsty desert sand. Oops, he said with a grin. Clumsy of me. Colt laughed at this display of casual cruelty, but Tommy looked away. His jaw clenched tight. Eliza watched the last drops of water vanish into the earth and felt something break inside her. Not her spirit that remained intact, burning like a coal in her chest, but some last vestige of the naive young woman who'd believed that being good, being decent, would protect her from the worst the world had to offer. You're monsters, she said quietly. Maybe, Marcus said, remounting his horse, but we're monsters with power, and you're just a schoolteacher with a drunk for a father and no one to protect her. He gathered up the rope that bound her wrists, checking the knots. The hemp had already rubbed her skin raw, and fresh blood seeped from beneath the bonds. Now, Mr. Stockton gave us very specific instructions, Marcus said, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. We're to bring you to the ranch unharmed, well, mostly unharmed and in a condition to walk down the aisle come tomorrow morning. He's planning quite a celebration. I won't marry him, Eliza said, and was surprised by the strength in her own voice. I don't care what you do to me. I won't say the words. Oh, you'll say them? Colt said, mounting his own horse. Trust me on that. Mr. Stockton can be very persuasive when he wants to be. Marcus kicked his stallion into motion, and once again Eliza found herself being dragged across the unforgiving desert floor. But this time she was ready for it. This time she locked her jaw and refused to give them the satisfaction of hearing her scream. As they rode, her mind drifted back to that morning. Was it really only a few hours ago when her world had still made sense? She'd been preparing for Sunday service, standing before the small mirror in her bedroom, when she'd heard the horses approaching. 3 riders moving fast. Her father had gone to the Silver Dollar the night before and hadn't returned, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the cold knot of dread that had formed in her stomach the moment she'd seen Marcus Brennan's face. Miss Hartwell, he'd said, tipping his hat in a mockery of politeness. Mr. Stockton requests your presence at his ranch. I'm afraid I have prior commitments, she'd replied, though her hands had been shaking as she'd straightened her dress. Perhaps another time. I'm afraid Mr. Stockton wasn't making a request. And then they'd shown her the papers. Her father's signature witnessed and notarized. $800 borrowed against the property, with Eliza herself listed as additional collateral. The terms were clear. If the debt wasn't paid within 30 days, everything reverted to Jeremiah Stockton. The 30 days had expired that morning. This isn't legal, she'd protested, though. Even then she'd known it was hopeless. People can't be used as collateral for debts. Tell that to your daddy, Colt had said with a laugh. He seemed to think you were worth at least $800, though between you and me, I think he sold himself short. They'd given her 5 minutes to pack a small bag. 5 minutes to gather up the few precious things that connected her to her mother, to the life she'd built for herself as Copper Ridge's schoolteacher. A photograph of her parents on their wedding day, her mother's gold locket, the leather-bound copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that had been her constant companion since childhood. All of it was now lost somewhere in the desert behind them. "Almost there," Marcus called out, and Eliza lifted her head to see a cluster of buildings rising from the desert like a mirage. Stockton's ranch was more like a small town, with a main house, several outbuildings, a blacksmith shop, and quarters for the dozen men who worked for him. It was an empire built on fear and violence, and it would be her prison. As they approached the main gate, Eliza saw him waiting for them. Jeremiah Stockton stood on the porch of his house, a tall, imposing figure in an expensive black suit. At 52, he was still handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, with silver-streaked hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything and feel nothing. He owned half the territory, controlled the other half, and had decided that Eliza would make a suitable wife to complement his growing empire. The fact that she'd refused him 3 times only seemed to have increased his determination to possess her. "Miss Hartwell," he said, as Marcus brought his horse to a stop near the porch. His voice was cultured, educated, the voice of a man who'd been born to privilege and had never known want. "Welcome to your new home." Eliza struggled to her feet, swaying from exhaustion and pain. Her dress was torn beyond repair, her hair was matted with blood and dust, and she was sure she looked like something that had crawled out of the desert to die. But she lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. "Mr. Stockton?" she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." He smiled, and the expression made her skin crawl. "On the contrary, Miss Hartwell, I believe everything is perfectly clear. Your father owed me money. He couldn't pay. So now you belong to me." "I belong to no one." "An admirable sentiment," Stockton said, descending the porch steps with the fluid grace of a predator. "But I'm afraid sentiment doesn't pay debts." Marcus cut her loose. Marcus dismounted and drew his knife, slicing through the rope that bound her wrists. Eliza rubbed the raw skin, feeling the sting of returning circulation. "Now then," Stockton said, stopping just out of arm's reach, "I know this situation is difficult for you, but I want you to understand that I'm not an unreasonable man. Marry me willingly and you'll be treated with the respect due to my wife. Refuse, and—" he gestured toward Marcus and Colt. "Well, my men can be quite persuasive." Eliza looked around the compound, taking in the armed men, the high walls, the vast emptiness of the desert beyond. Even if she could somehow escape, where would she go? Copper Ridge was 40 miles away across hostile territory. She had no horse, no water, no weapons. And even if she made it back to town, what then? Her father was clearly in Stockton's pocket, and the law was whatever Stockton said it was. But surrender wasn't in her nature. "I've already given you my answer, Mr. Stockton," she said. 3 times, in fact. "I won't marry you today, tomorrow, or ever." His smile never wavered, but something cold and dangerous flickered in his pale eyes. "I was hoping you'd reconsider given your current circumstances, but I can see you're as stubborn as ever." He turned to Marcus. "Take her to the guest room. Make sure she has everything she needs to make herself presentable for tomorrow's ceremony. And Marcus?" "Yes, sir." "Make sure she understands that her comfort depends entirely on her cooperation." As Marcus grabbed her arm and began leading her toward the house, Eliza heard Stockton call out behind them. "Oh, and Miss Hartwell, your father sends his regards. He wanted you to know that he's very grateful for your sacrifice. $800 is a lot of money for a man in his position." The words hit her like a physical blow, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her reaction. Instead, she kept walking, her head held high despite the pain radiating through her body. The guest room turned out to be on the 2nd floor of the main house, with a window that offered a view of the desert and a door that locked from the outside. The furnishings were expensive, but sparse. A 4-poster bed with clean linens, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a wardrobe that contained a single white dress clearly intended for tomorrow's ceremony. Marcus shoved her inside and then stood in the doorway, his gray eyes taking in every detail of the room. "Bathroom's down the hall," he said. "You'll be escorted if you need to use it. Dinner will be brought up at 6. The ceremony's at 10 tomorrow morning, so I suggest you get some rest." "And if I refuse to participate?" Marcus's smile was answer enough. "Mr. Stockton's a patient man, Miss Hartwell, but his patience has limits. You'd do well to remember that." He closed the door, and Eliza heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. She was alone for the first time since that morning, alone with her thoughts and her pain and the terrible knowledge of what tomorrow would bring. She walked to the window and looked out at the desert. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. Somewhere out there was Copper Ridge, and beyond that the life she'd built for herself, the school where she taught the town's children, the small house she'd shared with her father, the quiet dignity of a woman making her own way in the world. All of it was gone now, stolen by her father's weakness and Stockton's greed. But as she stood there watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, Eliza felt something stir within her. Not hope. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, but determination. A fierce, burning resolve that surprised her with its intensity. Tomorrow, Jeremiah Stockton expected her to walk down the aisle and say the words that would make her his property. He expected her to submit, to accept her fate, to become another acquisition in his growing empire. He was going to be disappointed. Eliza turned away from the window and began to examine her prison more carefully. The door was solid wood reinforced with iron bands. The window was too high to jump from, and even if she survived the fall, the desert beyond offered little hope of escape. But there had to be something, some weakness she could exploit. She had until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning to find it. As if summoned by her thoughts, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The key turned in the lock, and the door opened to reveal a young Mexican woman carrying a tray of food. She was maybe 16, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "Señorita," she said softly, setting the tray on the small table near the window. "I am Rosa, Mr. Stockton. He says I am to help you prepare for tomorrow." Eliza studied the girl's face, looking for any sign of sympathy or alliance. "Rosa, how long have you worked here?" 2 years, señorita, since my papa died and we had nowhere else to go. My little brother Miguel, he works in the stables. Mr. Stockton, he gives us food and shelter, so we work for him." There was something in the girl's voice, a carefully controlled neutrality that suggested she'd learned to survive by keeping her thoughts to herself. But when their eyes met, Eliza saw something else. A flash of understanding, of shared knowledge about what it meant to be powerless in Jeremiah Stockton's world. "Rosa," Eliza said carefully, "do you know why I'm here?" The girl's eyes darted toward the open door where Eliza could see a guard standing in the hallway. "Señorita, I think maybe you should eat something. You will need your strength for tomorrow." It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. Rosa knew exactly why Eliza was here, and she didn't approve. The question was whether that disapproval could be turned into something useful. "The dress in the wardrobe," Eliza said. "Is that supposed to be my wedding dress?" "Sí, señorita. Mr. Stockton, he had it made special. He said you would look like an angel." An angel? Eliza almost laughed at the irony. Tomorrow morning she would be dressed like an angel and handed over to a devil. "Rosa," she said, lowering her voice so the guard couldn't hear. "I need you to know something. I'm not going to marry Mr. Stockton, not willingly. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever you see or hear, I want you to remember that." The girl's eyes widened with alarm. "Señorita, please, you must not say such things. If someone hears—" "I'm not asking you to help me," Eliza said quickly. "I'm just asking you to remember. Can you do that?" Rosa nodded slowly, though fear clouded her features. "Sí, señorita, I will remember." After Rosa left, Eliza ate the simple meal of beans and bread, forcing herself to consume every bite despite her lack of appetite. She would need her strength for whatever came next. Then she examined the white dress more carefully, noting its construction, the way the seams were sewn, the placement of the buttons. By the time full darkness had fallen over the desert, she had a plan. It wasn't a good plan. In fact, it was barely a plan at all, but it was something. And sometimes, something was enough. She lay down on the bed, fully clothed, and stared up at the ceiling. Tomorrow morning, Jeremiah Stockton expected her to walk down the aisle and become his wife. He expected her to submit to his will, to accept her fate as his property. But Eliza Hartwell had been shaped by the harsh realities of frontier life, tempered by loss and hardship, and strengthened by her mother's fierce independence. She was not the delicate flower Stockton imagined her to be. Tomorrow morning, he would learn exactly what kind of woman he was trying to break. As she lay there in the darkness, listening to the desert wind whistle around the corners of the house, Eliza made herself a promise. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever price she had to pay, she would not go quietly into the cage Stockton had prepared for her. She had said no 3 times already. Tomorrow, she would say it again. The first gray light of dawn was creeping through the window when Eliza heard the key turning in the lock. She'd been awake for hours, her mind racing through every possible scenario, every potential escape route, every way tomorrow's ceremony might unfold. Sleep had been impossible with the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on her like a stone. Rosa entered with another tray this time, carrying coffee and fresh bread. Behind her came an older woman Eliza hadn't seen before, heavy-set with graying hair and the stern expression of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is Mrs. Caldwell," Rosa said quietly. "She is the housekeeper. She will help you prepare." Mrs. Caldwell set down a basin of steaming water and began laying out various items on the washstand. Soap towels, a brush for her hair. Her movements were efficient, but not unkind, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years managing a large household. "Mr. Stockton wants you looking your best for the ceremony," she said without preamble. "The minister arrives at 9:30. The guests will be gathering in the main parlor by 10. You'll need to be ready." "Guests?" Eliza asked, surprised. She'd assumed this would be a private affair witnessed only by Stockton's men. "Oh yes," Mrs. Caldwell said, beginning to unpack the white dress from its wrapping. "Mr. Stockton has invited several prominent families from the territory, the Masons from Flagstaff, the Chandlers from Phoenix, Judge Morrison and his wife. He wants this to be a proper celebration." The revelation hit Eliza like a physical blow. Stockton wasn't just planning to force her into marriage. He was planning to make it a public spectacle, witnessed by respectable people who would later testify to its legitimacy. Once those witnesses saw her walk down the aisle and heard her speak the vows, whether willingly or under duress, any later claims of coercion would be dismissed as the ravings of a hysterical woman. It was diabolically clever. "Mrs. Caldwell," Eliza said carefully, "surely you can see that this isn't right. I'm being forced into this marriage against my will." The older woman's hands paused in their work, and for a moment her stern expression softened slightly. "Miss Hartwell, I've worked for Mr. Stockton for 8 years. In that time, I've learned that fighting him only brings more pain for everyone involved." There was something in her voice, a weariness, a resignation born of hard experience that told Eliza this woman had seen what happened to people who crossed Jeremiah Stockton. Mrs. Caldwell might not approve of what was happening, but she'd made her peace with it long ago. "Now then," Mrs. Caldwell continued, her businesslike tone returning, "let's get you cleaned up. The water's still warm." Rosa began helping Eliza out of her torn and blood-stained dress, her gentle hands careful around the cuts and bruises that marked her ordeal in the desert. When Eliza caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she gasped. Her face was a map of scratches and contusions. Her lip was split, and there was a dark bruise along her left cheek where Colt had struck her. Her arms and shoulders were crisscrossed with rope burns and cactus scratches. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd been dragged 40 miles across the desert against her will. "Dear Lord," Mrs. Caldwell muttered, examining the extent of Eliza's injuries. "What did they do to you?" "They made sure I understood my place," Eliza said quietly. Mrs. Caldwell's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she began gently cleaning the wounds with warm water and soap. Her touch surprisingly tender for such stern-looking hands. "Rosa," she said after a moment, "go to my room and bring the face powder and rouge from my dressing table. We'll need to cover some of these bruises if she's to look presentable." As Rosa hurried out, Mrs. Caldwell continued her work in silence. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was another girl 3 years ago, Maria Santos. Her father owed Mr. Stockton money couldn't pay. Same situation as yours." Eliza's hands stilled in the water. What happened to her? She refused him, fought him every step of the way, so he found other ways to collect his debt. Mrs. Caldwell's voice was thick with old pain. "They found her body a week later out in the desert. Officially, she'd been thrown from her horse." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Eliza understood the message clearly: submit or suffer Maria Santos's fate. "Why are you telling me this?" Eliza asked. Mrs. Caldwell met her eyes in the mirror. "Because I liked Maria. She was a good girl like you, and because—" She hesitated, then continued in a rush. "Because I have a daughter about your age back in Kansas. If she were in your position, I'd want someone to warn her about the choice she was really facing." Before Eliza could respond, Rosa returned with the cosmetics. The next hour passed in a strange dreamlike preparation ritual. Mrs. Caldwell and Rosa worked to transform her from a battered captive into something resembling a proper bride. They combed the tangles from her hair, pinning it up in an elaborate style that would have been fashionable in any drawing room back east. They powdered her bruises until they were barely visible, added color to her pale cheeks, and helped her into the white dress. The gown was beautiful. Eliza had to admit silk and lace with intricate beadwork that must have cost more than her father made in a year. It fit her perfectly, which meant Stockton had been planning this for some time, having her measurements taken somehow without her knowledge. The thought made her skin crawl. "There," Mrs. Caldwell said, stepping back to admire their work. "You look beautiful, dear, like a proper bride." Eliza stared at her reflection and saw a stranger looking back, a pale, elegant woman in an expensive dress, her injuries hidden beneath powder and paint. She looked like she belonged in Stockton's world of wealth and privilege. She looked like exactly the kind of wife a territorial politician would want by his side. She looked like a lie. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said quietly, "if I don't survive this day, will you remember what really happened here? Will you remember that I never consented to any of this?" The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "Miss Hartwell, please don't talk like that. Mr. Stockton, he's not an evil man, not really. He's just accustomed to getting what he wants." "And what about what I want?" Mrs. Caldwell had no answer for that. The sound of horses arriving in the courtyard below drew them to the window. Eliza watched as carriages and riders began arriving for what Stockton was presenting as a celebration. She recognized some of the faces from her trips to other towns in the territory, wealthy ranchers, politicians, businessmen who formed the unofficial aristocracy of Arizona. They were laughing and talking as they dismounted, dressed in their finest clothes for what they believed was a joyous occasion. None of them knew they were about to witness a woman being sold into slavery disguised as a wedding. "The minister's here," Rosa said softly, pointing to a tall, thin man in black who was being escorted toward the house by one of Stockton's men. "Reverend Patterson from Flagstaff." Eliza's heart sank. She'd been hoping the ceremony would be conducted by some corrupt justice of the peace who might be susceptible to bribery or appeals to conscience. But Reverend Patterson was known throughout the territory as a man of genuine faith and integrity. If he performed the ceremony, he would expect it to be a real marriage entered into freely by both parties, which meant Stockton would have to find a way to make her cooperation appear genuine. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Caldwell opened it to reveal Marcus Brennan dressed in his best suit but still wearing his gun belt. His gray eyes took in Eliza's transformation with obvious approval. "Mr. Stockton's compliments," he said with mock formality. "He requests the pleasure of Miss Hartwell's company in his study before the ceremony begins." Eliza's stomach clenched. This was it, whatever Stockton planned to do to ensure her cooperation. It would happen now in private before the witnesses arrived. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Marcus's smile was thin and cold. "I'm afraid that wasn't a request, Miss Hartwell. Mr. Stockton was very specific about wanting to speak with you alone." Mrs. Caldwell and Rosa exchanged worried glances, but neither dared to intervene. They'd already done more than Eliza had any right to expect by treating her with kindness. "It's all right," Eliza said, though her hands were shaking as she smoothed down her skirt. "I'll speak with Mr. Stockton." Marcus offered her his arm with exaggerated courtesy. "Right this way, Miss Hartwell. Wouldn't want to keep your groom waiting." They walked through corridors lined with expensive artwork and furniture that spoke of Stockton's wealth and power. The house was larger than Eliza had realized, easily the size of the hotel back in Copper Ridge, with room after room filled with the trappings of success. It was the home of a man who'd carved out his own kingdom in the wilderness and filled it with beautiful things. Stockton's study was on the ground floor, a masculine room dominated by a massive oak desk and lined with bookshelves. The man himself stood by the window looking out at his arriving guests. He'd dressed for the occasion in an expensive black suit with a silk vest, and his silver hair was perfectly groomed. He looked every inch the successful rancher and politician. "Ah, Miss Hartwell," he said without turning around. "Please come in. Marcus closed the door behind you." Eliza heard the door shut and the sound of a key turning in the lock. She was alone with Stockton now, with nowhere to run and no one to call for help. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin up and her expression defiant. "You look beautiful," Stockton said, finally turning to face her. "That dress suits you perfectly. I had it made by the finest dressmaker in San Francisco." "Planning ahead, were you?" Eliza asked. "I'm always planning ahead, my dear. It's how one builds an empire." He moved to his desk and poured himself a glass of whiskey from a crystal decanter. "Drink?" "No, thank you." "Of course not. A proper lady doesn't drink before her wedding." He took a sip and studied her over the rim of his glass. "You've caused me quite a bit of trouble, Miss Hartwell. 3 public rejections of my proposals. Do you have any idea how that looked to my associates? I imagine it looked like a woman exercising her right to choose her own husband." Stockton laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Choice, my dear girl, you seem to have some very romantic notions about how the world works. Choice is a luxury afforded to those with power. You have no power. Your father gambled away everything you might have inherited, including your freedom." He set down his glass and moved closer to her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive, refined, and somehow cloying. "But I'm not an unreasonable man," he continued. "I understand that this situation is difficult for you, so I'm prepared to offer you a bargain." "What kind of bargain?" "Cooperation. Walk down that aisle, willingly say your vows with conviction, play the part of the devoted bride. Do that, and I'll treat you with the respect due to my wife. You'll have a comfortable life, beautiful clothes, a position of prominence in territorial society. You'll want for nothing. Except freedom. Freedom is overrated, particularly for women. What is freedom compared to security? To wealth? To position?" His pale eyes glittered with a kind of zealous intensity. "I can give you everything a woman could want. And if I refuse—" His expression didn't change, but something cold and terrible flickered in his eyes. "Then you'll discover just how unpleasant life can become for someone with no protection, no family, and no friends. I own this territory, Miss Hartwell. I control the law, the courts, the newspapers. If you displease me, you'll find that accidents happen to troublesome people with alarming frequency." The threat was delivered in the same cultured conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd shouted or threatened her openly. "You're talking about murder," Eliza said quietly. "I'm talking about reality. Ask anyone in Copper Ridge about Maria Santos. Ask them about Sheriff Walsh. Ask them about the newspaper editor who tried to write unflattering articles about my business practices." He shrugged eloquently. "The desert is a dangerous place, Miss Hartwell. Accidents happen." Eliza felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. She was looking into the face of a man who'd killed before and would kill again without the slightest hesitation, a man who saw murder as simply another business tool, no different from bribery or intimidation. "So," Stockton continued, returning to his desk, "what will it be, a comfortable life as my wife, or—" He left the alternative unspoken, but it hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Eliza closed her eyes and thought of her mother's last words to her, spoken from her deathbed as consumption ravaged her lungs. "Some fires cannot be bought or broken, my darling. Remember that no matter what comes." When she opened her eyes, Stockton was watching her with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "I need to know something first," she said. "What's that? My father, where is he really?" Stockton's smile was like the edge of a knife. "Your father is exactly where I told you he was, drunk at the Silver Dollar, spending the money I gave him for delivering you to me." The words hit her like physical blows. "You paid him $50. Not much considering what he was selling, but more money than he'd seen in months. He was quite grateful, actually, kept thanking me for taking care of his little girl." Stockton's voice dripped with mock sentiment. Touching really the bond between father and daughter? Eliza felt something die inside her chest, some last vestige of love and respect for the man who'd raised her, who'd taught her to read and write, who'd once been her hero. The knowledge that he'd not only failed to protect her, but had actively participated in her betrayal was almost more than she could bear. But even as grief and rage warred within her, she felt something else rising to take their place, a cold, clear fury that burned like ice. Her father had betrayed her. Stockton thought he owned her. Marcus and Colt had taken pleasure in her suffering. They all saw her as a thing to be used, a commodity to be traded, a problem to be solved. They were about to learn how wrong they were. "I see understanding dawning in those lovely eyes," Stockton said with satisfaction. "Good. It's so much easier when we all understand the situation clearly." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Eliza said, and her voice was so calm, so controlled, that Stockton's smile faltered slightly. "You want me to walk down that aisle and pretend to be a willing bride? You want me to convince all those respectable witnesses that this is a love match entered into freely and joyfully?" "Exactly. And in return, you'll treat me with the minimal courtesy due to your wife, at least in public." "You're a quick learner, Miss Hartwell." Eliza nodded slowly, as if considering his offer seriously. "There's just one problem with your plan, Mr. Stockton." "What's that?" She met his eyes directly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet strength of steel. "I would rather die than give you what you want." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Stockton's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, and finally a cold anger that made his pale eyes glitter like chips of ice. "I see," he said quietly. "You've chosen to be difficult. I've chosen to be myself." "Very well." He moved to the door and unlocked it, calling out to someone in the hallway. "Marcus Colt, I need you in here." The two men appeared in the doorway within seconds, and Eliza knew they'd been waiting just outside, ready for exactly this scenario. Marcus looked grimly satisfied, while Colt wore an expression of barely contained anticipation. "Ms. Hartwell has decided to be uncooperative," Stockton said calmly. "I'm afraid we'll need to adjust her attitude before the ceremony." "My pleasure," Colt said, cracking his knuckles. "Carefully," Stockton warned. "She needs to look presentable for the guests, nothing that can't be covered with powder." Eliza backed toward the window, her mind racing. The study was on the ground floor, but it was still a 10-foot drop to the courtyard below. Even if she survived the fall, she'd be in the middle of Stockton's compound, surrounded by his men and his guests. But maybe if she could create enough of a disturbance. "Now, Miss Hartwell," Marcus said, advancing slowly. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Mr. Stockton's being more than generous with his offer." "Generous?" Eliza laughed, and the sound held no humor at all. "He's offering to rape me with legal sanction and call it marriage. How exactly is that generous?" Colt's eyes lit up with cruel amusement. "Rape hell, lady, you might even enjoy it. Mr. Stockton's got experience with reluctant fillies." The casual way he spoke about violence against women, as if it were nothing more than breaking a horse, sent a surge of rage through Eliza that burned away her fear. These men saw her as weak, helpless, broken. They expected her to crumble under their threats and submit to their will. They were about to discover their mistake. As Marcus reached for her, Eliza grabbed the heavy crystal decanter from Stockton's desk and swung it with all her strength. It caught him across the temple with a sound like breaking ice, and he dropped to the floor like a stone, blood streaming from his scalp. "You little bitch!" Colt snarled, lunging toward her. Eliza threw the decanter at his head, forcing him to duck, then grabbed the next thing her hand found, a bronze statue of a horse that must have weighed 10 pounds. Colt was faster than Marcus, though, and he caught her wrist before she could swing it. "Got some fight in you after all," he said, twisting her arm until she cried out and dropped the statue. "I like that. Makes it more interesting." He backhanded her across the face, the blow hard enough to split her lip and send her stumbling into Stockton's desk. The taste of blood filled her mouth, but instead of weakening her, it seemed to fuel the fire burning in her chest. "That's enough," Stockton said sharply as Colt raised his hand again. "I said carefully, you fool. We don't have time to repair extensive damage." She broke Marcus's head open. "Marcus will live, but if you ruin her appearance, we'll have to postpone the ceremony and I won't have my guests thinking something's wrong." Stockton moved to check on Marcus, who was groaning and trying to sit up. "Miss Hartwell, I hope you're satisfied. You've accomplished nothing except ensuring that your future husband's patience is now completely exhausted." Eliza wiped blood from her lip with the back of her hand. "Good. I'd hate for you to have any illusions about what kind of wife I'll make." "Oh, I have no illusions at all," Stockton said, his voice soft and deadly. "You're going to be a very unhappy wife indeed. Marcus, can you stand?" Marcus struggled to his feet, one hand pressed to his bleeding temple. His gray eyes when he looked at Eliza were murderous. "I'm fine, boss. Just give me 5 minutes alone with her." "Later. Right now we have a ceremony to conduct." Stockton checked his pocket watch. "The guests are assembled, the minister is waiting, and I refuse to keep them waiting any longer." He moved to a cabinet behind his desk and withdrew a small brown bottle in a cloth. "Chloral hydrate," he explained conversationally. "Enough to make her docile and compliant, but not enough to make her obviously drugged. She'll be conscious and able to speak, but far too confused to cause any more trouble." Eliza's heart hammered as she realized what he intended. Drugged into compliance, she'd appear to go willingly to her wedding, and any later protests would be dismissed as hysteria or second thoughts. It was the perfect solution to his problem. "Hold her," Stockton ordered. Colt grabbed her arms from behind while Marcus' blood still trickling down his face took hold of her head. She fought them with desperate strength, twisting and kicking, but they were both larger and stronger than her. Stockton soaked the cloth with the clear liquid from the bottle and advanced toward her. "This will all be over soon," he said soothingly. "In an hour you'll be Mrs. Jeremiah Stockton, and this unpleasantness will be just a memory." The cloth was inches from her face when the sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere outside the house. Not just one shot, but a sustained volley that sent the gathered guests screaming and scattering in the courtyard below. Stockton froze, the drugged cloth still in his hand. "What the hell?" More gunfire closer this time, and the sound of men shouting orders. Through the window, Eliza could see chaos in the courtyard as Stockton's men ran for cover and his guests fled toward their carriages. "Apache?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with concern. "Impossible. We have treaties with all the local tribes." But Stockton's face had gone pale, and Eliza could see doubt creeping into his eyes. A new sound reached them, the thunder of hooves approaching fast. Not the random attack of raiders, but the coordinated charge of mounted men who knew exactly where they were going. "Boss?" Colt set his grip on Eliza, loosening slightly. "Maybe we should—" The window behind Stockton exploded inward in a shower of glass and wood as something came crashing through it. Not something, someone. A man dressed in dark clothing moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to violence. He rolled as he hit the floor, came up with a rifle in his hands. And before anyone could react, he'd put a bullet through the cloth in Stockton's hand. "Nobody move," the stranger said quietly. In the sudden ringing silence that followed, Eliza got her first clear look at the man who'd just crashed through the window to save her. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and green eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room in a single glance. There was something about him, a stillness, a controlled danger that reminded her of a coiled spring ready to unleash devastating force. His rifle never wavered as he surveyed the scene, Stockton standing frozen with the remains of the drugged cloth in his hand, Marcus bleeding from his head wound. Colt still holding Eliza's arms, but now looking uncertain whether to continue restraining her or reach for his gun. "Let her go," the stranger said, and though his voice was quiet, there was no mistaking the authority in it. "Who the hell are you?" Stockton demanded, but Eliza noticed his cultured composure had cracked. For the first time since she'd known him, Jeremiah Stockton looked genuinely afraid. "Name's Jake Morrison," the stranger replied, "and you, I'm guessing, would be the famous Jeremiah Stockton." "This is private property," Stockton said, trying to regain his equilibrium. "You're trespassing." "Funny thing about trespassing," Jake said conversationally. "It's only a crime when you're not invited, and it seems like the lady here might have sent up quite a prayer for rescue." His eyes found Eliza's, and she saw something in them that she hadn't seen in any man's eyes for longer than she could remember. Respect. Not possession, not calculation, not the desire to own or control, just simple human respect for her as a person worthy of protection. "Let her go," Jake repeated, and this time the words carried the unmistakable promise of violence if his order wasn't obeyed. Colt released her arms and stepped back, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "Mister, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." "Wouldn't be the first time," Jake said easily, "but I'm still breathing, which is more than I can say for most folks who've tried to correct my mistakes." More gunfire echoed from outside, and through the broken window came the sound of men shouting orders and horses being ridden hard. Whatever force Jake had brought with him, they were keeping Stockton's men busy. Miss, Jake said, still not taking his eyes off the three men. "You hurt? I'm all right," Eliza managed, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Good. Now I'm thinking you might want to step away from these gentlemen while we discuss the terms of your release." Eliza moved quickly to put the desk between herself and her captors, her heart hammering with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Was this really happening? Was she actually being rescued, or was this some elaborate trick Stockton had devised to make her grateful enough to cooperate? "Mr. Morrison," Stockton said, and his voice had regained some of its composure. "I don't know what lies this woman has told you, but I assure you there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Hartwell is here of her own free will preparing for our wedding." Jake's laugh held no humor at all. "Is that right? And I suppose those rope burns on her wrists are from some kinky courting ritual?" Stockton's eyes flicked to Eliza's wrists where the marks from yesterday's ordeal were still clearly visible despite Mrs. Caldwell's attempts to cover them with powder. "There was a misunderstanding yesterday," Stockton said carefully. "A bit of high spirits that got out of hand, nothing more." "Uh-huh." Jake's rifle swung slightly to cover Marcus, who'd been edging slowly toward his gun. "Friend of yours there looks like he had his own misunderstanding with something hard and crystal-like." Marcus's hand froze halfway to his weapon. "You son of a bitch, You'll what?" Jake's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Draw on a man who's already got you covered. I admire optimism, but that's just plain stupid." The gunfire outside was dying down, replaced by the sound of men calling out what sounded like an all-clear signal. Jake's reinforcements had apparently secured the compound. "Miss Hartwell," Jake said, "I'm going to ask you a simple question, and I want a simple answer. Are you here because you want to be—" Eliza met his steady gaze and felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in days, someone was asking what she wanted, not telling her what she would do, not threatening her with consequences, not treating her like property to be negotiated over, just asking simply and directly what she wanted. "No," she said, and her voice was stronger now. "I'm here because these men dragged me from my home against my will, because my father sold me to pay his gambling debts, because Mr. Stockton thinks he can force me to marry him by threatening to kill me if I refuse." "Well then," Jake said, and she could hear the smile in his voice, even though his expression remained grimly focused on the three men. "I reckon that settles that." Stockton's face had gone ashen, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. "Mr. Morrison, you're making a grave error. This is a legal matter between myself and Miss Hartwell's father. The debt—" Jake interrupted his rifle still train. Stockton's face had gone ashen, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. "Mr. Morrison, you're making a grave error. This is a legal matter between myself and Miss Hartwell's father. The debt—" Jake interrupted his rifle still trained on the three men. "Doesn't include the woman. Last I checked, slavery was outlawed in these United States about 20 years ago." "This isn't slavery," Stockton protested. "It's a legitimate marriage contract. Signed by who?" Jake's green eyes were cold as winter steel. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the only signature that matters never touched any paper." Through the broken window came the sound of boots on the wooden porch outside, and Eliza heard a voice she didn't recognize calling out, "Jake compound secure." Most of Stockton's boys scattered to the wind when the shooting started. "How many casualties?" Jake called back without taking his eyes off his prisoners. "2 wounded on our side, nothing serious. 3 of theirs down, 1 dead. The rest ran like rabbits." Eliza felt a mixture of relief and horror wash over her. Men had died because of her situation, because someone had cared enough about her plight to risk violence to save her. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. "Mr. Morrison," Stockton said, and now there was a note of desperation creeping into his cultured voice. "Perhaps we can discuss this like civilized men. I'm sure we can reach some sort of accommodation." "The only accommodation I'm interested in," Jake said quietly, "is seeing Miss Hartwell safely away from here. Everything else is just details." Colt, who'd been silent since Jake's arrival, finally spoke up. "Mister, you got any idea who you're messing with? Mr. Stockton owns half this territory. He's got friends in Washington, judges in his pocket, politicians who owe him favors. You think you can just ride in here and take his woman without consequences?" "His woman." Jake's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Boy, you just said the wrong words to the wrong man." The rifle barrel swung toward Colt, and Eliza saw something flicker in Jake's green eyes, a controlled fury that made her suddenly very glad he was on her side. "Miss Hartwell doesn't belong to anyone," Jake continued, his voice deadly calm. "Not to her father, not to Stockton, not to any man breathing. She's a free woman with the right to choose her own path. And if that's a concept you can't wrap your empty head around, I'd be happy to provide a more permanent education." Marcus, blood still trickling from his temple wound, made his choice. His hand darted toward his gun, betting that Jake's attention on Colt would give him the split second he needed. It was a fatal miscalculation. Jake's rifle cracked like thunder in the confined space of the study. Marcus's gun cleared leather by perhaps an inch before the bullet took him center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the expensive carpet. He tried to speak, blood frothing at his lips, then went still. The sudden violence left Eliza's ears ringing and her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd seen death before. Consumption had taken her mother slowly, inexorably, but this was different. This was sudden, final, the brutal severing of a life in the space between heartbeats. "Anyone else feeling educational?" Jake asked conversationally, working the lever action of his rifle to chamber another round. Colt's face had gone pale, and his hands were carefully extended away from his weapons. Even Stockton seemed stunned by the sudden turn of events, his political composure finally cracking completely. You murdered him," Stockton stammered. "I defended myself against an armed man drawing on me," Jake corrected. "Lot of witnesses outside who'll testify to hearing the shot, seeing him go for his gun first. Self-defense is still legal even in your little kingdom." The sound of footsteps on the stairs drew everyone's attention, and a moment later a man appeared in the doorway, tall, lean, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He wore a badge on his vest that read U.S. Marshal. "Jake," the marshal said, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. "Situation under control." "Getting there, Ben," Jake replied. "Miss Hartwell, I'd like you to meet Marshal Ben Tucker. He's been very interested in Mr. Stockton's business practices." Eliza looked between the two men, confusion adding to the chaos of emotions swirling through her. "Marshal, I don't understand. Federal investigation," Marshal Tucker explained, stepping carefully around Marcus's body. "We've been tracking reports of forced marriages, coercion, and suspicious deaths throughout the territory for the better part of a year. Your situation came to our attention through some very concerned citizens in Copper Ridge." "Mrs. Patterson," Eliza breathed, suddenly understanding. The minister's wife had been teaching alongside her at the school, had known about her father's gambling and Stockton's persistent proposals. When Eliza had disappeared, Mrs. Patterson must have put the pieces together. "Among others," Tucker confirmed. "Took us a while to gather enough evidence to move, and by then you'd already been taken. We came as fast as we could." Stockton's composure was crumbling completely now. His pale eyes darting between the marshal and Jake like a trapped animal seeking an escape route that didn't exist. "This is preposterous," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "I'm a respected businessman, a contributor to territorial development. Whatever stories you've heard include sworn statements from 3 families whose daughters disappeared after their fathers fell into debt with you." Tucker interrupted. "Maria Santos, Catherine Wells, and Elena Rodriguez, all 3 supposedly died in riding accidents after refusing your marriage proposals." The names hit Eliza like physical blows. 3 other women. 3 other families destroyed by Stockton's greed and cruelty. 3 other young women who'd said no and paid the ultimate price for their defiance. "You can't prove anything," Stockton said, but even as he spoke, his eyes were calculating distances to doors and windows, looking for any possible escape. "Can't we—" Tucker pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Federal warrant for your arrest on charges of kidnapping, coercion, conspiracy, and suspicion of murder, signed by a federal judge in Denver who's very interested in cleaning up the territory." Colt, who'd been silent since Jake's demonstration of marksmanship, suddenly bolted for the door. He made it perhaps 3 steps before Jake's rifle spoke again, the bullet shattering the doorframe inches from Colt's head and sending him diving for cover behind Stockton's desk. "Next one won't be a warning," Jake said calmly, already working the lever to chamber another round. "Smart choice," Tucker said as Colt slowly raised his hands above the desk. "Now, Mr. Stockton, you can come along quietly and maybe live to see a trial, or you can make this difficult and end up like your friend there." For a moment, Eliza thought Stockton might surrender. His empire was crumbling around him, his men were dead or scattered, and federal law had finally caught up with his crimes. But then she saw something change in his pale eyes, a cold calculation that sent ice through her veins. "Marshal Tucker," Stockton said, his voice regaining some of its smoothness. "Before you arrest me, perhaps you should consider the political ramifications of this action." Meaning I have friends in very high places, senators who've benefited from my contributions to their campaigns, judges who owe their appointments to my influence, cabinet members who've enjoyed my hospitality. Stockton's smile was like the edge of a blade. "This territory isn't some lawless frontier anymore, Marshal. It's becoming a state with all the political complexities that entails." Tucker's expression didn't change, but Eliza saw something flicker in his eyes, the weary recognition of a man who'd dealt with political corruption before. "Are you threatening a federal officer, Mr. Stockton?" "I'm simply pointing out the realities of territorial politics. A man in my position doesn't simply disappear without questions being asked, important questions by important people who might not appreciate having their business relationships disrupted." Jake's rifle swung back to cover Stockton directly. "Ben, are we going to stand here and listen to this son of a bitch threaten us, or are we going to do what we came here to do?" "Easy, Jake," Tucker said, though his hand had moved to rest on his gun butt. "Mr. Stockton, political connections or not, you're under arrest. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the federal government takes a dim view of slavery regardless of what you choose to call it." "Evidence?" Stockton laughed, and the sound held genuine amusement. "What evidence? The testimony of a known drunk like Thomas Hartwell. The statements of grieving families who'd say anything to explain their daughter's tragic accidents. The word of a hysterical woman who's clearly been through some sort of ordeal." His pale eyes fixed on Eliza with predatory intensity. "Miss Hartwell has been under considerable stress, Marshal. Her father's debts, her own financial difficulties, the pressure of my courtship, it's clearly affected her judgment. I'm sure once she's had time to recover, she'll remember events quite differently." The implications of his words hit Eliza like cold water. Even if she testified against him, even if other families came forward, Stockton's lawyers would paint her as an unreliable witness, a woman driven to hysteria by financial pressure and romantic disappointment. Her testimony would be dismissed, her credibility destroyed, and Stockton would walk away free to find new victims. "That's quite a theory," Jake said quietly. "Only problem is, it assumes Miss Hartwell is the only witness to what happened here." "What do you mean?" Stockton's confidence faltered slightly. Jake smiled, and the expression was predatory. "Rosa Valdez, the Mexican girl who works in your kitchen. Turns out she's been writing letters to her cousin in Santa Fe, describing in great detail what goes on in this house. Letters that describe forced marriages, disappearing women, and very specific threats made against anyone who might speak out." Eliza saw Stockton's face go white. In his arrogance, he'd never considered that the servants he treated like furniture might have eyes, ears, and the ability to bear witness against him. That's hearsay," Stockton stammered. "The testimony of a servant girl is every bit as valid as anyone else's in a federal court," Tucker finished, "especially when it's corroborated by physical evidence. We found Maria Santos's jewelry in your private safe, Mr. Stockton, along with personal items belonging to the other missing women." "Trophies?" Jake said with disgust. "You kept trophies of the women you murdered." The revelation hit Eliza like a physical blow. Not only had Stockton killed those women, he'd kept mementos of their deaths, items that would have been precious to their families, stolen along with their lives. "They were gifts," Stockton said desperately. "Tokens of affection from women who cared for me." "Maria Santos's wedding ring?" Tucker asked quietly. "The one her mother described in detail down to the inscription inside. That was a gift." Stockton opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to realize that every word was only making his situation worse. His pale eyes darted between Jake and Tucker, calculating odds and finding them wanting. That's when Eliza noticed his hand moving slowly toward the drawer of his desk. "Gun!" she shouted. Jake's rifle cracked an instant before Stockton's hand reached its target, the bullet splintering the desk drawer and sending wood flying. Stockton jerked his hand back with a cry of pain as splinters bit into his fingers. "Much obliged, Miss Hartwell," Jake said, working the lever to chamber another round. "Mr. Stockton, you keep making poor choices. At this rate, you're going to run out of chances to make better ones." Tucker moved quickly to the desk, pulling out a small nickel-plated revolver from the damaged drawer. "Interesting. Not the kind of gun a man keeps for hunting." Self-defense, Stockton said, cradling his injured hand. A man in my position has enemies. I'll bet he does, Jake said grimly. The sound of horses approaching at a gallop drew everyone's attention to the broken window. Through the glass, Eliza could see a cloud of dust rising from the main road riders coming fast toward the compound. More of your men, Tucker asked Stockton. I don't know, Stockton replied, but there was something in his voice, a note of hope that made Eliza's stomach clench with dread. Jake moved to the window, keeping his rifle trained on the room while peering out at the approaching riders. 6 men coming hard. Don't recognize any of them. Territorial militia, Stockton said, and now there was definite satisfaction in his voice. I sent word yesterday that federal agents were operating in the territory without proper authority. Seems they've arrived to investigate. Tucker cursed under his breath. Jake, we need to move, now. What about him? Jake nodded toward Stockton. Leave him. We've got what we came for. Tucker turned to Eliza. Miss Hartwell, can you ride? Yes, but no buts. We've got maybe 5 minutes before this place is crawling with militia, and they're not going to be interested in hearing about federal warrants or women's rights. Tucker moved toward the door. Jake, get her out of here. What about you? I'll be right behind you, just need to collect some evidence from that safe. Jake grabbed Eliza's hand, his grip strong and reassuring. Miss Hartwell, I know this is all happening fast, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that? She looked into his green eyes and saw something she'd almost forgotten existed. Genuine concern for her well-being with no ulterior motive or hidden agenda. This man was risking his life to save her, asking nothing in return except her trust. Yes, she said simply. Good. Stay close to me, do exactly what I say, and we'll get through this. They moved quickly through the corridors of Stockton's house, past expensive furniture and artwork that spoke of wealth built on other people's misery. Through the windows, Eliza could see the approaching militiamen in uniform, but riding hard like they were chasing outlaws rather than investigating a legal matter. Jake led her through a side door that opened onto a stable yard where several horses were waiting. His men, she counted 4 of them, were already mounted and ready to ride. These weren't the kind of men she was used to seeing in Copper Ridge. They had the hard, competent look of professional gunfighters, men who sold their skills to the highest bidder. Miss Hartwell, one of them said, touching his hat brim in greeting. Name's Charlie Webb. Pleased to make your acquaintance. Where's Tucker? Another asked Jake. Collecting evidence. He'll catch up. Jake helped Eliza mount a bay mare that seemed calm and well-trained. Miss Hartwell, this is Sadie. She's got good manners and a steady disposition. Just give her her head and she'll take care of you. The sound of gunfire erupted from inside the house, not the sharp crack of rifles, but the deeper boom of shotguns and pistols, multiple weapons firing in a sustained exchange that spoke of serious fighting. Damn! Jake muttered, his face grim. Ben's in trouble. We going back for him? Charlie asked. Jake was already turning his horse toward the house when Tucker appeared in the doorway, clutching a leather satchel in one hand and a smoking pistol in the other. Blood was streaming from a cut on his forehead, and his shirt was torn. Move, he shouted. They've got men coming around the back. The militia had reached the main compound now, and Eliza could see uniformed men dismounting and taking positions around the buildings. But these didn't look like legitimate soldiers. They looked like hired guns wearing military gear, the kind of men Stockton would recruit to do his dirty work. This way, Jake called, spurring his horse toward a gap in the compound's rear wall. Stay low and keep moving. They rode hard across the desert, the horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth as gunfire erupted behind them. Eliza had never ridden so fast in her life, clinging to the saddle horn as Sadie stretched out in a full gallop. The wind whipped her carefully arranged hair loose from its pins, and the white wedding dress she still wore billowed around her like a banner. Behind them, Stockton's compound was disappearing in a cloud of dust, but the sound of pursuit was growing louder. The militia, or whatever they were, had mounted up and were following hard, their horses fresh and their determination obvious. They're gaining on us, Charlie called out. Jake glanced back, his face grim. How many? 8, maybe 10, and they're riding like they mean business. Tucker, who was riding beside Eliza despite his injuries, reached into his satchel and pulled out several folded papers. Evidence, he explained, seeing her questioning look. Letters from Stockton to associates describing his methods, financial records showing payments to corrupt officials, everything we need to bring him down. If we live long enough to use it, one of Jake's men, a young redhead named Tommy, said grimly. We'll make it, Jake said with quiet confidence. Miss Hartwell, how are you holding up? I'm fine, she managed, though her legs were already aching from the unfamiliar strain of riding at such speed. Where are we going? Safe place about 10 miles north of here. Federal Marshal's station with a telegraph office. We get there, we can call for backup and get you somewhere safe. A rifle shot cracked behind them, the bullet whining past close enough that Eliza felt the wind of its passage. Their pursuers were getting close enough to start taking aimed shots. Time to make this interesting, Jake said, pulling his horse up sharply. Charlie, Tommy, get Miss Hartwell and the marshal out of here. Don't stop for anything. Jake, no, Tucker protested. You can't hold them all off by yourself. Won't be by myself, Jake replied, and Eliza saw two of his other men, a dark-skinned man named Moses and a grizzled veteran called Dutch pulling up alongside him. We'll give you a head start, then catch up. This is crazy, Eliza said, but even as she spoke, she understood the tactical necessity. Their pursuers were fresher, better mounted, and gaining ground steadily. Someone had to slow them down, and Jake was volunteering himself and his men for what could easily be a suicide mission. Crazy's just another word for necessary sometimes, Jake said, checking his weapons. Miss Hartwell, you get to that marshal station and you tell them everything. Make sure Stockton doesn't walk away from this. Jake, go, he said firmly. Charlie, ride like hell and don't look back. Charlie grabbed the reins of Eliza's horse and spurred his mount forward. The last thing she saw before they crested a low ridge was Jake and his two men taking positions behind a cluster of boulders, their rifles glinting in the afternoon sun as they prepared to make their stand against overwhelming odds. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them, not the sporadic shooting of pursuit, but the sustained, desperate firing of men fighting for their lives. Eliza wanted to look back, wanted to know what was happening to the man who'd risked everything to save her, but Charlie kept driving them forward across the empty desert. Is he going to make it? She asked Tucker, who was swaying in his saddle but grimly hanging on. Jake Morrison's the most dangerous man I've ever known, Tucker replied. If anyone can get out of that alive, it's him. But even as he spoke, the gunfire behind them was dying away, and Eliza felt her heart sink. Had Jake and his men been overwhelmed? Were they lying dead in the desert while Stockton's corrupt militia continued their pursuit? There, Tommy called out, pointing ahead. The station! Eliza looked up to see a small cluster of buildings rising from the desert like a mirage, a main building, a stable, and a tall pole with telegraph wires stretching away across the wasteland. The flag of the United States flew from a pole beside the main building, and she could see armed men taking positions around the perimeter. Federal marshals, Tucker explained, been waiting for our signal. They rode hard for the station, their horses lathered with sweat and blowing hard from the long chase. As they approached, Eliza could see more men emerging from the buildings, a dozen federal marshals armed with rifles and shotguns taking defensive positions around the compound. Tucker, one of them called out. About time you showed up. We heard shooting. Stockton's hired guns, Tucker replied, sliding from his saddle with obvious effort. Maybe 10 of them coming hard. What about Morrison? Tucker's face was grim. He stayed behind to buy us time. Haven't heard from him in the last few minutes. The marshal, a tall man with a graying beard who wore his authority like a comfortable coat, turned to Eliza with curious eyes. And you'd be Miss Hartwell, I'm guessing. Yes, sir, she replied, suddenly aware of how she must look disheveled, blood-stained, wearing a torn wedding dress in the middle of the desert. Are you? Marshal Samuel Hayes, Federal District Supervisor. We've been very interested in meeting you, Miss Hartwell. Your testimony is going to be crucial in bringing Jeremiah Stockton to justice. If he's still alive to face justice, Tucker said grimly. He had armed men at the compound, claims political protection from territorial officials. This could get complicated fast. Hayes nodded. Already is complicated. Got a telegram this morning from the territorial governor demanding we cease operations and withdraw from the territory. Seems Mr. Stockton has friends in high places. What are you going to do? Eliza asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Our job, Hayes said simply. Federal law trumps territorial politics, and we have more than enough evidence to prosecute. The question is whether we can get you somewhere safe while the legal process plays out. The sound of approaching horses cut off any further conversation. Everyone turned toward the desert, weapons ready, as a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. But instead of the pursuing militia, 3 riders emerged from the haze, Jake Morrison and his 2 men, their horses blown, but all 3 men very much alive. Eliza felt relief wash over her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. She'd known Jake Morrison for less than a day, but the thought of him dying because of her situation had been almost unbearable. "What happened?" Hayes asked as Jake dismounted. "Discouraged their enthusiasm for pursuit," Jake replied laconically. "Doubt they'll be following us anytime soon. All of them. Let's just say their commanding officer had a sudden change of heart about federal jurisdiction." Jake's green eyes were cold and hard. Amazing how reasonable a man can become when he's looking down the barrel of a rifle. Marshal Hayes studied Jake's face for a moment, then nodded. "I see. Well, whatever happened out there, I'm glad you made it back safely." Jake turned to Eliza, his expression softening. "Miss Hartwell, are you hurt? Did they harm you during the escape?" "I'm fine," she said, though she was discovering that the word fine covered a multitude of physical and emotional states. "Thanks to you and your men." "Sir." "Just doing what needed doing," Jake said simply. "Question now is what happens next." "Next," Marshal Hayes said, "we get Miss Hartwell's formal statement, document her injuries as evidence, and prepare our case against Stockton. Then we escort her somewhere safe while the legal process runs its course. And Stockton will be arrested as soon as we can locate him. Won't be easy, man like that has bolt holes and safe houses scattered all over the territory. But we'll find him." Eliza looked out at the desert, thinking about the man who'd tried to own her, who'd murdered other women for refusing him, who'd turned her own father against her with 50 pieces of silver. Somewhere out there, Jeremiah Stockton was free planning his next move, perhaps already selecting his next victim. "Marshal Hayes," she said quietly, "what if he runs? What if he disappears into Mexico or California and starts over somewhere else? Then we'll follow him," Hayes replied. "Federal jurisdiction extends throughout the United States, Miss Hartwell, and we have very long memories when it comes to men who think they can buy their way out of justice." Jake moved closer to her, his presence reassuring and solid. "Miss Hartwell, I want you to know this isn't over. Stockton's going to try to discredit you, claim you're lying or mentally unstable. He's got lawyers and politicians in his pocket, and they'll use every trick they know to protect him." "I understand," she said, though the prospect of facing Stockton's counterattack was terrifying. "But I won't back down. Too many women have suffered because of him. Too many families have been destroyed." "That's what I hoped you'd say," Jake said with a slight smile, "because we're going to need your strength for what comes next." As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, Eliza stood among her rescuers and felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember: hope. Not the naive hope of a young woman who believed the world was fundamentally just, but the hard-earned hope of someone who'd looked into the abyss and chosen to fight back. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Stockton's lawyers would attack her credibility. His political allies would try to suppress the evidence, and his hired guns might attempt more direct solutions. But tonight, she was free. Tonight, she was surrounded by men who'd risked their lives to save her, not because they wanted to own her, but because they believed she deserved better. It was, she thought, a good beginning for whatever came next. That hope proved to be fragile when the first telegram arrived 3 days later at the federal marshal's station. Marshal Hayes found Eliza in the small room they'd given her, sitting by the window and watching the desert wind bend the scattered cacti into impossible shapes. She'd been trying to write a letter to Mrs. Patterson to thank the minister's wife for her courage in contacting the authorities, but the words kept escaping her. "Miss Hartwell," Hayes said quietly, holding the yellow paper in his weathered hands. "We need to talk." Something in his tone made her stomach clench with dread. "What is it?" Hayes closed the door behind him and took the chair across from her small desk. "This came in from Denver this morning, from the territorial governor's office." He handed her the telegram, and as she read the terse lines, she felt the hope of the past 3 days crumble into dust. The message was brief but devastating. All federal operations in the territory were to cease immediately pending review of jurisdictional authority. Marshal Hayes and his men were ordered to return to Denver within 48 hours. Any prisoners or evidence collected was to be turned over to territorial authorities. "Stockton," she whispered. "Has friends in very high places," Hayes confirmed grimly. "Higher than we thought. This order came directly from Washington with the territorial governor's full support. Someone with real power is protecting him. Eliza set the telegram down with trembling hands. What does this mean for the case against him? Officially, it means there is no case. Territorial authorities have declared the matter outside federal jurisdiction. The evidence we collected has been deemed inadmissible, and the territorial court has already dismissed all charges against Stockton for lack of credible witnesses. The words hit her like physical blows. 3 days ago, she'd been rescued by federal agents, surrounded by men who'd promised justice for the women Stockton had murdered. Now those same agents were being ordered to abandon her to the mercy of the very system that had failed to protect her in the first place. And unofficially, she asked, though she was afraid of the answer. Hayes leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Unofficially, Jake Morrison refuses to acknowledge territorial authority over crimes committed against federal citizens. He's planning something and he wants to talk to you about it. Where is he? Outside waiting. But Miss Hartwell, before you talk to him, you need to understand what's at stake here. If you choose to continue fighting this, you'll be doing it without federal protection. The territorial government has already issued a warrant for your arrest on charges of making false accusations against a prominent citizen. Stockton's lawyers are painting you as a mentally unstable woman seeking revenge against a man who spurned your advances. Eliza laughed, though the sound held no humor. My advances, I refused him 3 times. They're claiming you proposed to him, and when he refused, you concocted this elaborate story of kidnapping and coercion to damage his reputation. They have witnesses who'll swear you were pursuing him aggressively, that your father brought you to Stockton's ranch voluntarily to arrange a marriage, and that you fled in a fit of feminine hysteria when Stockton gently declined your proposal. That's insane. Who would believe such a story? People who want to believe it, Hayes said grimly. People who profit from Stockton's business, who owe him favors, who fear what might happen to them if his empire crumbles. The territorial judge who'll hear the case owns 3 businesses that depend on Stockton's freight contracts. The sheriff who'd arrest you served under Stockton during the Apache Wars. Even the newspaper editor who'd report on the trial took a $1,000 loan from Stockton's bank last year. The scope of Stockton's influence was staggering. He hadn't just built a business empire, he'd constructed an entire network of debt and obligation that made him untouchable through legal channels. Every official who might stand against him was either in his pocket or too afraid of the consequences to act. So what you're telling me, Eliza said slowly, is that the law can't touch him, that he's going to walk away free to do this to other women. I'm telling you that conventional justice has failed, Hayes replied. But Jake Morrison isn't a conventional man, and he's never been much for respecting authority when authority fails to do its job. Before Eliza could respond, a soft knock came at the door. Hayes called out permission to enter, and Jake stepped into the room. He'd cleaned up since their escape from Stockton's compound, trading his desert-stained clothes for a simple white shirt and dark pants. But his green eyes still held that same controlled intensity that had marked him as dangerous from the moment she'd first seen him. Miss Hartwell, he said with a slight nod. Marshal Hayes tell you about the telegram. He did. She studied his face, trying to read the thoughts behind those steady green eyes. He said you wanted to talk to me about something. Jake glanced at Hayes, who stood and moved toward the door. I'll be outside, the marshal said. Whatever you two decide, I never heard this conversation. When they were alone, Jake took the chair Hayes had vacated and fixed Eliza with a direct stare. Miss Hartwell, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. How much do you want Jeremiah Stockton to pay for what he's done? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Eliza could hear the implication clearly. Jake wasn't talking about legal justice anymore. He was talking about something else entirely. Something that would put them both outside the law. What are you suggesting? She asked quietly. I'm suggesting that sometimes the law isn't enough. Sometimes justice has to be taken by people willing to risk everything to see it done. Jake leaned forward, his voice intense but controlled. Stockton thinks he's untouchable because he owns judges and politicians, but he can't buy everyone and he can't hide from everyone forever. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice for Maria Santos, for Catherine Wells and Elena Rodriguez, for you and for every woman who'll suffer if Stockton continues to walk free. Jake's eyes never wavered from hers. The law has failed, Miss Hartwell. The question is whether you're willing to step outside the law to see justice done. Eliza stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vast expanse of desert that stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, Jeremiah Stockton was celebrating his victory, already planning his next move, perhaps already selecting his next victim. The thought of him continuing his predatory existence, protected by corrupt officials and purchased silence, made her stomach burn with fury. "If I say yes," she said without turning around, "what would that mean exactly?" "It would mean becoming someone the territorial authorities would hunt for the rest of your life. It would mean giving up any chance of a normal existence, any hope of marriage or family or the quiet life you built as a schoolteacher. It would mean becoming a fugitive. And if I say no, then you disappear. New name, new life somewhere far from Arizona where Stockton's influence can't reach. Hayes has contacts who can make that happen. You could be teaching school in Oregon or California within a month with papers that would stand up to any scrutiny." The choice he was offering her was stark and terrible. Safety at the cost of abandoning justice, or justice at the cost of abandoning safety. Either way, the life she'd known was over. "Would it work?" she asked. "Your plan, whatever it is, would it actually stop him?" "It would stop him permanently," Jake said, and there was no mistaking his meaning. "But it wouldn't be clean or legal or anything you could ever talk about afterward, and there'd be no guarantee we'd survive the attempt." Eliza closed her eyes and thought about her mother's last words about the fire that couldn't be bought or broken. She thought about Maria Santos, who died alone in the desert rather than submit to Stockton's will. She thought about the young women who would follow if Stockton remained free to continue his predatory existence. When she opened her eyes and turned back to Jake, her decision was made. "What do you need me to do?" Something shifted in Jake's expression, approval perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "First, you need to understand that this isn't just about Stockton. He's the head of a network that includes corrupt officials, bought judges, and hired killers. Taking him down means taking down the entire system that protects him." "How is that possible?" "Because they've made the same mistake that powerful men always make. They've underestimated their enemies and overestimated their own security." Jake stood and began pacing the small room. "Stockton thinks he's won. He thinks the federal investigation is over and he can go back to business as usual. That overconfidence is going to be his downfall." "I still don't understand what role I'm supposed to play in this." Jake stopped pacing and fixed her with that intense stare again. "You're going to walk back into Stockton's world and make him believe he's won completely." The words sent a chill down Eliza's spine. "You want me to go back to him? I want you to appear to go back to him, voluntarily, of your own free will. You're going to tell him that your ordeal opened your eyes to the reality of your situation, that you've realized fighting him is hopeless, and that you're prepared to accept his proposal of marriage." "He'll never believe that." "He'll want to believe it," Jake corrected. "Men like Stockton need to see themselves as irresistible as natural winners who always get what they want in the end. The idea that you've come crawling back to him will appeal to his vanity so strongly that he'll ignore any warning signs." "And then what?" "Then you give him the wedding he's always wanted, a big public ceremony with all his important friends in attendance, politicians, judges, business associates, everyone who's part of his network of corruption." Jake's smile was cold and predatory. "Everyone who needs to be in one place at one time." The scope of what he was suggesting began to dawn on her. "You're planning to attack the wedding." "I'm planning to end the network that's protected Stockton and men like him for years. The wedding will bring together everyone who's complicit in his crimes, the judges who've dismissed charges against him, the politicians who've shielded him from investigation, the businessmen who've profited from his methods. One decisive action could cripple the entire system." "You're talking about killing dozens of people." "I'm talking about removing the cancer that's infected this territory for years," Jake said quietly. "These aren't innocent men, Miss Hartwell. They're accomplices to murder, rape, and every other crime Stockton has committed. They've chosen their side in this war." "War. Make no mistake, that's what this is. A war between those who believe might makes right and those who believe in actual justice. The law has already chosen its side, and it isn't ours." Eliza sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Jake was proposing. It wasn't just revenge against Stockton. It was a revolution against the entire corrupt system that had protected him. The kind of action that would echo through the territory for decades, that would either inspire others to stand up against corruption or provoke a violent crackdown against anyone who opposed the established order. "How many men do you have?" she asked. "Enough," Jake replied. But this isn't just about numbers. It's about timing, positioning, and having someone on the inside who can ensure everything goes according to plan. Someone like me. Someone exactly like you. The grieving fiancée who's finally accepted her fate, who's grateful for Stockton's forgiveness and eager to make amends for her earlier resistance. You'll be the perfect Trojan horse. And what happens to me when the shooting starts? Jake's expression softened slightly. That depends on how well we plan this. Ideally, you'd be safely away from the action when it begins. But I won't lie to you, there are no guarantees in something like this. Things could go wrong. People could get hurt who shouldn't. You could end up dead despite our best efforts. Or I could end up a widow free to start over wherever I choose. Or that, Jake agreed, but only if you're willing to play a very dangerous game with very high stakes. A knock at the door interrupted them. Hayes entered without waiting for permission, his face grim. "We have a problem. Territorial marshals just rode into town, 6 of them led by Deputy Marshal Crawford. They're asking questions about Miss Hartwell." Jake cursed under his breath. "How long do we have? Maybe an hour before they figure out where she is. Crawford's thorough and he's got a warrant for her arrest." "Then we need to move now," Jake said, turning back to Eliza. "Miss Hartwell, I need an answer. Are you willing to do this?" The moment of decision had arrived faster than she'd expected. In an hour, she'd either be in territorial custody facing charges that would likely see her imprisoned or hanged, or she'd be committed to a course of action that would make her a fugitive and a revolutionary. There was no middle ground, no safe compromise. She thought about her father drunk in some saloon and counting the money Stockton had paid him for her. She thought about Mrs. Patterson, who'd risked her own safety to contact the authorities. She thought about Rosa, the Mexican girl, who'd shown her kindness in Stockton's house, and about all the other women who'd learned to survive by keeping their heads down and their mouths shut. Most of all, she thought about Maria Santos, Catherine Wells, and Elena Rodriguez, 3 young women who'd said no to Jeremiah Stockton and paid for their defiance with their lives. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'll do it." Jake nodded as if he'd never doubted her answer. "Then we need to get you out of here and into character. By tonight, you need to be the broken, repentant woman who's realized her mistake and wants nothing more than to make amends to the man she wronged." "How do I contact him?" "You don't. He contacts you." Jake moved to the window and peered out at the approaching dust cloud that marked the territorial marshal's arrival. "Stockton has spies everywhere. In 2 hours, he'll know that you've been captured by territorial authorities and charged with making false accusations. Tomorrow he'll hear that you've been released on your own recognizance after recanting your testimony and admitting that you made everything up. Will he believe it? He'll want to believe it so badly that he'll ignore any doubts. The idea that he's broken you completely, that you've publicly admitted he was right all along, it'll appeal to his ego more than anything else could." Hayes appeared in the doorway again. "Jake, they're at the general store now. 5 minutes, maybe less." "Right." Jake turned back to Eliza. "From this moment on, you're no longer the woman who was dragged across the desert and held against her will. You're a confused, frightened girl who's realized she made a terrible mistake and wants nothing more than to make things right. Can you do that?" Eliza straightened her shoulders and felt something click into place inside her mind, not quite a different personality, but a different version of herself. The version that had learned to survive by giving men what they expected to see. "Mr. Morrison," she said, and her voice was softer now, more hesitant. "I'm so sorry for all the trouble I've caused. I don't know what came over me making up those terrible stories about Mr. Stockton. He's been nothing but kind to me, and I repaid his kindness with lies and hysteria." Jake's eyes glinted with approval. "Perfect. Remember that tone, that mindset. You're not angry anymore, you're ashamed, not defiant, grateful, not a victim, a woman who's seen the error of her ways. And when he proposes again, you accept with tears of joy and gratitude. You tell him you understand now how foolish you were to resist such a generous offer from such a distinguished man. You beg his forgiveness for the embarrassment you've caused him." The words tasted like poison in her mouth, but Eliza nodded. "I understand. Good. Now, when the territorial marshals arrest you, don't resist. Act confused and frightened. Tell them you've made a terrible mistake and you just want to go home and forget this whole nightmare. They'll think they've won an easy victory. The sound of horses stopping outside the marshal's station reached them through the window. Hayes drew his gun but kept it low by his side. "Showtime," Jake said quietly. "Miss Hartwell, the next time I see you, you'll be wearing a wedding dress and walking down the aisle to marry the man who tried to destroy you. Just remember that woman walking down the aisle isn't you. She's just a mask you're wearing until it's time to take it off." "And when will that be?" Jake's smile was cold and predatory. "When the church bells ring for your wedding ceremony and Jeremiah Stockton thinks he's finally won everything he's always wanted. That's when he'll learn the difference between owning someone and underestimating them." Voices outside were calling for the marshal to come out and talk. Hayes holstered his gun and moved toward the door. "This is it," he said. "Miss Hartwell, whatever happens next, remember that there are people who believe in what you're doing. People who think justice is worth fighting for even when the law fails." Eliza stood and smoothed down her dress, transforming herself into the character she would need to play. When she spoke, her voice carried the perfect note of feminine uncertainty. "Marshal Hayes, I want to thank you for your kindness, but I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I'm afraid I may have said some things that weren't entirely truthful, and I'd like to set the record straight with the territorial authorities." Hayes nodded, playing his part. "If that's what you want, Miss Hartwell, but you should know that once you talk to them, there's no taking it back." "I understand. I just want to go home and try to repair the damage I've done to Mr. Stockton's reputation. He doesn't deserve to suffer because of my foolishness." Jake had already disappeared through the back window, vanishing into the desert like a ghost. In a few hours, word would reach Stockton that his tormentor had been captured and had recanted her accusations. In a few days, he would receive a tearful letter begging his forgiveness and asking for another chance to prove herself worthy of his regard. And in a few weeks, when he stood at the altar confident in his complete victory, Jeremiah Stockton would discover that some fires burn brightest just before they consume everything around them. The front door of the marshal's station opened, and Deputy Marshal Crawford stepped inside with his hand resting on his gun butt. He was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and the kind of mustache that had been fashionable 20 years ago. "Marshal Hayes," he said formally, "I have a warrant for the arrest of one Eliza Hartwell on charges of making false accusations against a prominent citizen conspiracy to defame and disturbing the peace." "No need for warrants, Deputy," Eliza said, stepping forward with her head bowed submissively. "I surrender myself willingly. I have some things to confess that I think will clear up this whole unfortunate misunderstanding." Crawford's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir. I'm afraid I've been very foolish, and I've said some things about Mr. Stockton that simply aren't true. I'd like to make a full statement setting the record straight." "Well now," Crawford said, his stern expression softening slightly. "That's more like it. Always better when folks come to their senses and admit their mistakes." As Crawford led her outside to where his men were waiting, Eliza caught one last glimpse of Marshal Hayes through the window. The federal officer touched his hat brim in a gesture that could have been respect or farewell or simply acknowledgement of a job well done. Then she was mounted on a horse between two territorial marshals, riding toward what everyone believed would be her public humiliation and Stockton's complete vindication. What they didn't know was that she was riding toward the most dangerous performance of her life, one where a single wrong word or gesture could expose the plot and doom them all. But as the marshal's station disappeared behind them in a cloud of dust, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced since that morning when Marcus Brennan had first appeared at her door control. For the first time since this nightmare began, she was the one making the choices. She was the one setting the terms. Jeremiah Stockton thought he had won. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The territorial courthouse in Copper Ridge was packed beyond capacity when Eliza made her public recantation 3 days later. Word had spread throughout the territory that the woman who'd accused Jeremiah Stockton of kidnapping and forced marriage was going to admit she'd made it all up. People had come from as far as Flagstaff and Phoenix to witness what everyone assumed would be Stockton's complete vindication. Eliza stood before Judge William Morrison, no relation to Jake despite the name, and delivered the performance of her lifetime. Her voice trembled with what appeared to be shame and remorse as she admitted to fabricating the entire story out of spite and feminine hysteria. She begged forgiveness from the court, from the community, and most importantly, from the man she'd wronged with her lies. "Your Honor," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, "I want the world to know that Mr. Stockton is an honorable gentleman who showed me nothing but kindness and courtesy. My father's debts were real, but Mr. Stockton's offer of marriage was generous beyond anything I deserved. I was foolish and prideful, and when he withdrew his proposal after my ungrateful behavior, I'm afraid I lost my senses entirely." Judge Morrison, who owed his appointment to Stockton's political influence, nodded gravely. "Ms. Hartwell, false accusations against prominent citizens are a serious matter. However, the court recognizes that feminine sensibilities can sometimes overwhelm a woman's better judgment, particularly in matters of the heart. Yes, Your Honor, I throw myself upon the mercy of the court and upon Mr. Stockton's Christian forgiveness." From his seat in the front row, Jeremiah Stockton watched with obvious satisfaction as his accuser publicly humiliated herself. He was dressed in his finest suit, his silver hair perfectly groomed-looking, every inch the distinguished territorial politician. When the judge asked if he wished to press charges, Stockton rose with theatrical magnanimity. "Your Honor, Miss Hartwell has suffered enough. A woman's heart is a delicate thing, easily wounded by disappointment. I bear her no ill will, and wish only for her to find peace and happiness." The courthouse erupted in applause for Stockton's gracious forgiveness. Several prominent citizens stood to shake his hand and congratulate him on his Christian charity. The territorial newspaper editor was already scribbling notes for what would undoubtedly be a glowing article about Stockton's nobility in the face of vicious slander. But Eliza caught something else in Stockton's pale eyes as he accepted the crowd's accolades, a cold satisfaction that went beyond mere vindication. He wasn't just enjoying his victory, he was savoring her defeat. The public humiliation was almost as sweet to him as the original plan to force her into marriage. After the court session ended, Eliza found herself standing alone on the courthouse steps while the crowd dispersed around her. She'd played her part perfectly, but now came the most dangerous phase of the deception. She needed to approach Stockton without appearing too eager, needed to seem broken enough to be believable, but not so damaged as to be useless to him. "Miss Hartwell." She turned to find Stockton approaching, flanked by two of his men. Not the ones who dragged her across the desert, but new faces with the same cold professional demeanor. He stopped just close enough to speak privately, but far enough away to maintain the appearance of propriety. "Mr. Stockton," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I don't know how to thank you for your forgiveness." "Your public acknowledgement of the truth was thanks enough," he replied, though his pale eyes studied her face intently. "Tell me, Miss Hartwell, what are your plans now I understand your father has moved on from Copper Ridge?" It was true. Thomas Hartwell had disappeared the day after her rescue, taking Stockton's $50 and vanishing into the territory's network of mining camps and frontier towns. He'd abandoned his daughter to face the consequences of his betrayal alone. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted, and the pain in her voice wasn't entirely feigned. "My reputation is ruined, my family is gone, and I have no means of supporting myself. I suppose I'll have to throw myself on the charity of the church and hope they can find some family willing to take in a woman of questionable character." Stockton was quiet for a long moment, and Eliza could practically see the calculations running behind his eyes. Here was the woman who defied him publicly, now completely broken and dependent on his mercy. The opportunity to complete his victory by magnanimously rescuing her from destitution would appeal to both his ego and his sense of poetic justice. "That would be a tragedy," he said finally. "A woman of your education and refinement reduced to charity and servitude. Perhaps there might be another option." "Sir, my original offer of marriage stands, Miss Hartwell. Despite everything that's happened, I believe you could still make a suitable wife for a man in my position. You've learned some hard lessons about the realities of life in this territory, and I think that experience has given you a new appreciation for security and protection." Eliza let her eyes widen with what she hoped looked like grateful surprise. "Mr. Stockton, I couldn't possibly. After everything I've done, the lies I told about you are forgotten, he said firmly. The past is the past, Miss Hartwell. What matters is the future and whether you're wise enough to choose the right path this time. But surely you could find a more suitable wife, someone who hasn't brought such scandal upon herself. I could, Stockton agreed, but I've always believed in redemption, Miss Hartwell, in the possibility that people can learn from their mistakes and become better than they were. You've shown remarkable courage in admitting your errors publicly. That suggests a strength of character that I find admirable. The words were carefully chosen to sound generous while actually being deeply insulting. He was offering to marry damaged goods out of the goodness of his heart, taking pity on a woman who'd proven herself both foolish and dishonest. It was the kind of magnanimous gesture that would enhance his reputation while ensuring her complete gratitude and submission. I don't know what to say, Eliza whispered, letting tears gather in her eyes. After everything I've done, you would still consider me worthy of such an honor. I would, Stockton said, stepping closer, but I want to be clear about the terms, Miss Hartwell. This would not be a marriage of equals. You've proven yourself capable of lapses in judgment that could be damaging to my reputation and position. I would expect complete obedience, absolute loyalty, and a commitment to supporting my interests in all things. Of course, she said quickly. I understand completely. I would be honored to serve as your wife in whatever capacity you deem appropriate. Good. Stockton smiled, and the expression reminded her of a snake contemplating a particularly appealing meal. Then I suggest we proceed quickly. Another public wedding properly done this time with all the appropriate witnesses. I'm thinking 2 weeks from today, enough time to make the necessary arrangements, but not so long as to allow any second thoughts. 2 weeks? She repeated, her heart hammering against her ribs. That seems very generous. I see no point in delay. The sooner we can put this unfortunate episode behind us, the sooner we can begin building our future together. Stockton gestured to one of his men. Marcus will escort you to the hotel and see that you have appropriate accommodations. I'll send Mrs. Caldwell tomorrow to help you prepare. You'll need a proper wedding dress, of course, and instruction in the social graces expected of my wife. Thank you, Eliza said, lowering her eyes submissively. I promise you won't regret this kindness. I'm sure I won't, Stockton replied, though there was something in his voice that made her skin crawl. Good day, Miss Hartwell. I look forward to our wedding day. As Stockton walked away, Eliza allowed herself a moment of genuine emotion. Not gratitude, but a burning rage that she had to keep carefully hidden beneath her mask of submission. In 2 weeks, she would walk down the aisle to marry the man who'd murdered 3 women and tried to break her spirit. In 2 weeks, she would stand before God and witnesses and promise to love, honor, and obey a monster. But she would also be walking toward the moment when Jake Morrison and his men would finally balance the scales of justice. The moment when Jeremiah Stockton's network of corruption would be shattered forever. The hotel room Stockton provided was comfortable, but clearly chosen for security rather than luxury. It was on the 2nd floor, with only one window that faced the main street, where his men could keep watch from the building across the way. The door locked from the inside, but Eliza had no doubt that Stockton possessed a key. She was a prisoner again, but this time she was a willing one. The first week passed in a blur of wedding preparations that felt like elaborate theater. Mrs. Caldwell arrived as promised, bringing fabric samples and pattern books for a wedding dress that would befit Stockton's bride. The older woman seemed genuinely pleased by what she saw as Eliza's transformation from defiant captive to grateful fiancée. You've made the right choice, dear, she said while pinning the hem of Eliza's dress. Mr. Stockton is a powerful man who can give you everything a woman could want: security, position, respect, all the things that really matter in this world. I know, Eliza replied, standing perfectly still as Mrs. Caldwell worked. I was so foolish before, thinking I could make my own way in the world. A woman needs a man's protection, doesn't she? Indeed she does. The frontier is no place for feminine independence, no matter what those suffragettes back east might claim. A woman's place is beside her husband, supporting his endeavors and managing his household. The irony wasn't lost on Eliza that she was receiving lessons in feminine submission from a woman who clearly ran Stockton's domestic affairs with an iron fist. But she nodded and smiled, and played the part of the reformed, independent woman who'd learned to value traditional feminine virtues. Rosa was among the servants who came to help with the preparations, and Eliza was careful to show no sign of recognition. The Mexican girl worked quietly arranging flowers and polishing silver, but Eliza caught her watching sometimes with an expression that was hard to read. Did Rosa recognize the deception, or did she genuinely believe that Eliza had surrendered to Stockton's will? "Señorita," Rosa said quietly during one of their brief moments alone, Are you happy?" The question was carefully neutral, but Eliza heard the real inquiry beneath it. Rosa had witnessed Stockton's methods before, had seen what happened to women who resisted him. She wanted to know if Eliza was truly resigned to her fate or still fighting in her heart. "I'm grateful," Eliza replied carefully. "Mr. Stockton has shown me such kindness, forgiving my foolishness and offering me a chance to redeem myself. What more could a woman ask for?" Rosa nodded, but something flickered in her dark eyes, disappointment perhaps, or the death of a small hope that someone might still resist the monster who owned them all. On the second Wednesday, exactly 1 week before the wedding, Eliza received an unexpected visitor. She was in her room pretending to read a book of poetry that Stockton had sent as a gift when Mrs. Caldwell knocked on the door. "Miss Hartwell, there's a young man here to see you. Says he's your cousin from back east." Eliza's heart lurched, but she kept her expression calm. "My cousin, I'm afraid there must be some mistake. I don't have any family left. He seems quite certain. Says his name is James Morrison from your mother's side of the family. Very well-dressed young gentleman, though he has the look of someone who's traveled far." Morrison. Jake was using his real name, or at least part of it. Either he was supremely confident in his ability to handle any problems that arose, or the situation was desperate enough that risks no longer mattered. I suppose I should see him," Eliza said reluctantly. "But perhaps it would be better if you stayed during the visit. I wouldn't want there to be any impropriety." "Of course, dear. Mr. Stockton was quite specific about maintaining proper appearances." They went downstairs to the hotel's small parlor, where Jake waited with his hat in his hands and the deportment of a nervous young man meeting a relative under difficult circumstances. He'd somehow acquired Eastern clothes, a well-tailored suit, and polished shoes that made him look like a prosperous businessman rather than a frontier gunfighter. "Cousin Eliza," he said, rising as she entered, "I came as soon as I heard about your troubles. I'm so sorry for your loss." The word loss could have referred to her father's disappearance, her public humiliation, or something else entirely. Eliza chose to interpret it in the most obvious way. "James," she said with what she hoped sounded like surprised pleasure, "I had no idea you were even in the territory. How did you find me?" "Word travels even back east. When I heard about the court case and your situation, I felt I had to come. Families should stand together in times of trial." Mrs. Caldwell hovered nearby, clearly torn between her instructions to maintain propriety and her uncertainty about whether this qualified as an acceptable visit. "Perhaps I should inform Mr. Stockton that Miss Hartwell has a visitor." "Oh, that won't be necessary," Jake said quickly. "I don't want to impose on Mr. Stockton's time. I just wanted to offer my congratulations on Cousin Eliza's engagement and see if there was anything she needed for the wedding." "How thoughtful," Mrs. Caldwell said, clearly approving of Jake's deferential attitude toward Stockton's authority. "I'll just step into the kitchen and arrange for some tea." When they were alone, Jake's entire demeanor changed. The nervous Eastern gentleman disappeared, replaced by the controlled intensity of a man preparing for war. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," she whispered back. "He believes it completely. He thinks I'm broken, grateful, and completely under his control." "Good. Because we need to move the timeline up. Something's gone wrong with our original plan." Eliza felt ice form in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "Stockton's getting suspicious, not of you, of the situation in general. He's hired additional security for the wedding, brought in men from outside the territory who don't know the local situation, professional killers who won't be distracted by politics or personal relationships." "How many?" "Too many. My original plan was based on surprise and the element of chaos, but if he's expecting trouble..." Jake shook his head grimly. "We need to adjust our approach." Mrs. Caldwell's footsteps in the hallway warned them of her return. Jake immediately reverted to his role as the concerned cousin. "So tell me about the wedding plans," he said in a louder voice. "I understand it's going to be quite an event." "Oh yes. Eliza replied, accepting the cup of tea Mrs. Caldwell offered. Mr. Stockton wants it to be a proper celebration. The church ceremony, then a reception at his ranch with all the prominent families in attendance. Wonderful. I don't suppose, would it be presumptuous of me to ask if I might attend as your only remaining family member? Mrs. Caldwell looked uncertain. Well, I suppose, if Mr. Stockton approves, it would only be proper for Miss Hartwell to have family present. I'll speak to him about it, Eliza said. I'm sure he'll understand the importance of family on such an occasion. Excellent, Jake said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'd be honored to witness such a joyous event. They chatted for another few minutes about inconsequential matters, the weather, the territorial politics, the recent Apache troubles in the southern regions. All perfectly normal conversation between relatives who hadn't seen each other in years. But beneath the surface pleasantries, Eliza sensed Jake's tension like a coiled spring. When he finally took his leave, pressing her hand in what looked like a gesture of familial affection, she felt him slip something small into her palm. A piece of paper folded tight and warm from his pocket. Give my regards to your fiancé, he said aloud. I look forward to meeting him properly. I will, she promised. Thank you for coming, James. It means more than you know to have family here. After he left, Eliza waited until she was alone in her room before unfolding the paper. The message was brief and written in Jake's careful handwriting. Change of plan. Wedding night, not ceremony. When church bells ring, midnight be ready. Tell no one. Trust no one. Burn this. She read the message 3 times to make sure she understood it completely, then fed the paper to the small fire in her room's hearth and watched it turn to ash. Whatever Jake had planned for the wedding ceremony was off the table. Instead, he was moving the confrontation to the wedding night itself, when Stockton would be at his most vulnerable and confident. The implications sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. On her wedding night, she would be alone with Stockton in his private chambers, expected to fulfill the wifely duties she'd spent weeks pretending to accept. If Jake's timing was even slightly off, if something went wrong with whatever signal system he'd arranged, she pushed the thought away. Jake Morrison had risked his life to save her once already. She had to trust that he would do so again, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. The final week passed with agonizing slowness. Stockton visited her twice, both times playing the role of the considerate fiancé, checking on his bride's preparations. He brought gifts, expensive jewelry, fine perfumes, a leather-bound volume of romantic poetry that she was expected to treasure. Each visit was a test of her acting ability, forcing her to express gratitude and affection for a man she was planning to help destroy. You seem nervous, my dear, he observed during his final visit the day before their wedding. Wedding day jitters are perfectly natural for a young woman, but I want you to know that you have nothing to fear from me. The statement was so absurd, given what she knew of his history, that Eliza had to fight to keep her expression neutral. I'm not nervous exactly, just overwhelmed by your generosity. I keep thinking I must be dreaming that tomorrow I'll wake up and find none of this is real. It's real, Stockton assured her, taking her hand in his. His skin was soft and cold, like touching a snake. Tomorrow you'll become Mrs. Jeremiah Stockton with all the privileges and responsibilities that entails. I trust you understand what I expect from you as my wife. Complete loyalty and obedience, she recited, support for your political and business interests, discretion in all matters concerning your affairs, and, she let her voice trail off with apparent embarrassment, and, he prompted with obvious amusement, and the fulfillment of my wifely duties. She finished, allowing a blush to color her cheeks. Very good. I can see that Mrs. Caldwell has prepared you well for married life. Stockton lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that made her skin crawl. I think we're going to have a very successful marriage, my dear, very successful indeed. That night, Eliza lay awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep around her. Tomorrow, she would put on the white dress that Mrs. Caldwell had so carefully fitted and walk down the aisle of St. Matthew's Church to marry a murderer. She would speak vows of love and fidelity to a man who collected women's jewelry as trophies of his crimes. And tomorrow night, when the church bells rang midnight and Stockton expected to claim his husbandly rights, Jake Morrison would finally balance the scales of justice. The question was whether she would live to see it. Dawn brought a flurry of activity as Mrs. Caldwell and Rosa arrived to help her prepare for what everyone believed would be the most important day of her life. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of white silk and Belgian lace with a train that would sweep behind her as she walked down the aisle. The veil was her mother's, the one piece of her past that Stockton had allowed her to keep, probably because it enhanced the romantic imagery of the occasion. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Caldwell said as she fastened the last of the pearl buttons. "Like an angel." Rosa said nothing. But when their eyes met in the mirror, Eliza saw something there that might have been sorrow or regret. The Mexican girl had witnessed too many of Stockton's weddings to believe in the fairy tale everyone else was celebrating. The carriage ride to St. Matthew's Church felt like a funeral procession, despite the cheerful decorations and the crowds of well-wishers lining the streets. Stockton had spared no expense in making this a public celebration of his victory. The church bells were ringing, flowers decorated every lamppost and storefront, and a brass band played wedding marches from the town square. Inside the church, the cream of territorial society had gathered to witness Jeremiah Stockton's triumph. Eliza recognized judges, politicians, business leaders, and their wives, all the people who formed the network of influence and corruption that had protected Stockton for years. These were the people Jake had originally planned to target, the accomplices who'd enabled Stockton's crimes through their silence and complicity. Now they were simply witnesses to what they believed was a romance triumph, the story of a wayward woman who'd seen the error of her ways and gratefully accepted the protection of a generous man. As the wedding march began, and Eliza started her slow walk down the aisle, she found herself thinking not of the man waiting for her at the altar, but of the women who'd walked this path before her. Maria Santos, Catherine Wells, Elena Rodriguez, had they stood where she was standing now, wearing white dresses and speaking vows of love to the man who would kill them had they believed even for a moment that submission might save them. Stockton stood at the altar in his finest black suit, silver hair gleaming and pale eyes fixed on her with obvious satisfaction. Beside him stood his best man, a territorial judge who owed his appointment to Stockton's influence, and behind them both, the minister who would sanctify this union with God's blessing. As she reached the altar and took her place beside the man who'd tried to own her, Eliza felt a strange calm descend over her. This wasn't her wedding, it was her performance, the greatest acting challenge of her life with the highest possible stakes. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jeremiah Stockton and Eliza Hartwell in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over her as she played her part perfectly. She spoke her vows with apparent sincerity, promising to love, honor, and obey until death did them part. She accepted Stockton's ring with trembling hands that everyone interpreted as evidence of bridal nerves. She even managed to look radiant when he kissed her at the altar, sealing their union before God and witnesses. The reception at Stockton's ranch was a lavish affair, with enough food and drink to feed half the territory. The guests danced and celebrated late into the evening, toasting the happy couple and praising Stockton's magnanimity in forgiving his bride's earlier indiscretions. Everyone agreed it was the social event of the year, a fairy tale ending to a story that had threatened to become a tragic scandal. But as the evening wore on and the guests finally began to depart, Eliza felt the weight of what was coming settling over her like a shroud. Soon she would be alone with her new husband, expected to fulfill the marital obligations she'd promised in front of all those witnesses. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the ranch, Jake Morrison was waiting for the church bells to ring midnight. As the last carriage disappeared into the night and the servants finished cleaning up the reception, Stockton appeared at her side with a glass of champagne and the satisfied smile of a man who'd finally achieved everything he'd ever wanted. "Mrs. Stockton," he said, savoring the words, "how does it feel to finally be where you belong?" Eliza met his pale eyes and smiled with what she hoped looked like grateful contentment. "Like coming home," she said softly. "Like everything that happened before was just a bad dream and now I've finally woken up." "Indeed you have," Stockton agreed, raising his glass in a toast. "To new beginnings, my dear, and to the understanding that some things are simply meant to be." As the clock on the mantel chimed 11:30, Eliza lifted her own glass and met his toast. "To understanding," she said quietly, "and to getting exactly what we deserve." Neither of them noticed that 30 minutes remained until midnight, or that the church bells of Copper Ridge were about to ring a very different kind of celebration than anyone expected.